Hey, Duke, not a dollar. If I needed that horse, I'd hang on to him, and you wouldn't get him a cent under $35. But when a man don't need a horse, and it's an expense to him, he can afford to give it away. He can give it away and make money. That's what I'm a-doing, if you want to take me up." "I'll take a look at him, Jim." Jim got up with eagerness and went to fetch a saddle and bridle from under the wagon. The others came into the transaction with lively interest. Only Taterleg edged round to Lambert and whispered, with his head turned away to look like innocence, "Watch out for him. He's a bald-faced hyena." They trooped off to the corral, which was a temporary enclosure made of wire run among the little pines. Jim brought the horse out. It stood tamely enough to be saddled, with head drooping indifferently, and showed no deeper interest and no resentment over the operation of bridling. Jim talking all the time, he worked like the faker that he was, to draw a too close inspection of his wares. "Old Whetstone ain't much to look at," he said, "and as I told you, mister, he ain't got no fancy gait, but he can bust the middle out of the breeze when he lays out a straight-ahead run. Ain't a horse on this range can touch his tail when old Whetstone throws a ham into it and lets out his strength." "He looks like he might go some," Lambert commented in a vacuous way of a man who felt he must say something, even though he didn't know anything about it. Whetstone was rather above the stature of the general run of range horses, with clean legs and a good chest, but he was a hammer-headed, white-eyed, short-maned beast of a pale water-color yellow, like an old dish. He had a beaten-down, bedraggled, and dispirited look about him, as if he had carried man's burdens beyond his strength for a good while, and had no heart in him to take the road again. He had a scoundrelly way of rolling his eyes to watch all that went on about him, without turning his head. Jim girthed him and cinched him soundly and securely, for no matter who was pitched off and smashed up in the ride, he didn't want the saddle to turn and be ruined. "Well, there he stands, Duke. Saddle and bridle goes with him, if you're able to ride him. I'll be generous. I won't go halfway with you. I'll be whole hog or none. Saddle and bridle goes with Whetstone. All a free gift if you can ride him, Duke. I want to start you up right." It was a safe offer, taking all precedent into account, for no man had ever ridden Whetstone, not even his owner. The beast was an outlaw of the most pronounced type, with a repertory of tricks calculated to get a man off his back, so extensive that he never seemed to repeat. He stood always as docilely as a camel to be saddled and bridled. With what method in his apparent docility no man versed in horse philosophy ever had been able to reason out. Perhaps it was that he had been born with a spite against man, and this was his scheme for luring them out of his discomfiture and disgrace. It was an expectant little group that stood by to witness this greenhorn's rise and fall according to his established methods. Whetstone would allow him to mount, still standing with that indifferent droop of his head, but one who was sharp would observe that he was rolling his old wide eyes back to see, tipping his sharp ear like a wildcat to hear every scrape and creak of the leather. Then, with the man in the saddle, nobody knew what he would do. That uncertainty was what made Whetstone valuable and interesting beyond any outlaw in the world. Men grew accustomed to the tricks of ordinary pitching broncos in time, and the novelty and charm were gone. Besides, there nearly always was somebody who could ride the worst of them. Not so Whetstone. He had won a good deal of money for Jim, and everybody in camp knew that $35 wasn't more than a third of the value that his owner put upon him. There was boundless wonder among them then, and no little admiration, when this stranger, who had come into that unlikely place on a bicycle, leaped into the saddle so quickly that old Whetstone was taken completely by surprise, and held him with such a strong hand and stiff rein that his initiative was taken from him. The greenhorn's next maneuver was to swing the animal round till he lost his head, then clap heels to him and send him off as if he had business for the day laid out ahead of him. It was the most amazing start that anybody had been known to make on Whetstone, and the most startling and enjoyable thing about it was that this strange overgrown boy, with his open face and guileless speech, had played them all for a bunch of suckers, and knew more about riding in a minute than they ever had learned in their lives. Jim Wilder stood by, swearing by all his obscene deities that if that man hurt Whetstone, he'd kill him for his hide. But he began to feel better in a little while. Hope, even certainty, picked up again. Whetstone was coming to himself. Perhaps the old rascal had only been elaborating his scheme a little at the start, and was now about to show them that their faith in him was not misplaced. The horse had come to a sudden stop, legs stretched so wide apart it seemed as if he surely must break in the middle. But he gathered his feet together so quickly that the next view presented him with his back arched like a fighting cat's, and there on top of him rode the Duke, his small brown hat in place, his gray shirt ruffling in the wind. After that there came so quickly that it made the mind and eye hasten to follow all the tricks that Whetstone ever had tried in his past triumphs over men, and through all of them, sharp, shrewd, unexpected, startling as some of them were, the little brown hat rode untroubled on top. Old Whetstone was as wet at the end of 10 minutes as if he had swum a river. He grunted with anger as he heaved and lashed. He squealed in his resentful passion as he swerved, lunged, pitched, and clawed the air. The little band of spectators cheered the Duke, calling loudly to inform him that he was the only man who had ever stuck that long. The Duke waved his hat in acknowledgment and put it back on with deliberation and exactness, while old Whetstone, as mad as a wet hen, tried to roll down suddenly and crush his legs. Nothing to be accomplished by that old trick. The Duke pulled him up with a wrench that made him squeal, and Whetstone lifted his forelegs, attempted to complete the backward turn and catch his tormentor under the saddle. But that was another trick so old that the simplest horseman knew how to meet it. The next thing he knew, Whetstone was galloping along like a gentleman, just wind enough in him to carry him, not an ounce to spare. Jim Wilder was swearing himself blue. It was a trick, an imposition, he declared. No circus rider could come out here and abuse old Whetstone that way and live to eat his dinner. Nobody appeared to share his view of it. They were a unit in declaring that the Duke beat any man handling a horse they ever saw. If Whetstone didn't get him off pretty soon, he would be whipped and conquered, his belly on the ground. "If he hurts that horse, I'll blow a hole in him as big as a can of salmon," Jim declared. "Take your medicine like a man," Siwash advised. "You might know somebody'd come along that'd ride him in time." "Yeah, come along," said Jim with a sneer. Whetstone had begun to collect himself out on the flat along the sagebrush a quarter of a mile away. The frenzy of desperation was in him. He was resorting to the raw, low, common tricks of the ordinary outlaw, even to biting at his rider's legs. That ungentlemanly behavior was costly, as he quickly learned, at the expense of a badly cut mouth. He never had met a rider before who had energy to spare from his efforts to stick in the saddle, to slam him a big kick in the mouth when he doubled himself to make that vicious snap. The sound of that kick carried to the corral. "I'll fix you for that," Jim swore. He was breathing as hard as his horse, sweat of anxiety running down his face. The Duke was bringing the horse back, his spirit pretty well broken, it appeared. "What do you care what he does to him? Ain't your horse no more." It was Taterleg who said that, standing near Jim, a little way behind him, as gorgeous as a bridegroom in the bright sun. "You fellers can't ring me in on no game like that and beat me out of my horse," said Jim, redder than ever in his passion. "Who do you mean, rung you in, you little flannel-faced fisty?" Siwash demanded, whirling round on him with blood in his eye. Jim was standing with his legs apart, bent a little at the knees, as if he intended to make a jump. His right hand was near the butt of his gun. His fingers were clasping and unclasping, as if he limbered them for action. Taterleg slipped up behind him on his toes and jerked the gun from Jim's scabbard with quick and sure hand. He backed away with it, presenting it with determined mien as Jim turned on him and cursed him by all his lurid gods. "If you fight anybody in this camp today, Jim, you'll fight like a man," said Taterleg, "or you'll hobble out on 3 legs like a wolf." The Duke was riding old Whetstone like a feather, letting him have his spurts of kicking and stiff-legged bouncing without any effort to restrain him at all. There wasn't much steam in the outlaw's antics now. Any common man